The ground moved first. That was the warning, but it was not the real catastrophe. On March 11, 2011, at 2:46 p.m., the northeastern coast of Japan felt one of the most violent earthquakes in modern history. Office buildings swayed, roads trembled, power flickered. People grabbed decks, walls, railings, whatever their hands could find. In Tokyo, far from the worst of the coast, towers rolled with a slow, unnatural motion that made the strongest structures feel suddenly alive. Trains stopped, phones jammed, sirens began to spread across the country. Japan knew earthquakes. That was part of its identity. The country had drills, engineering, warning systems, memory, and discipline. It was one of the most prepared places on earth to face shaking ground. And yet, what arrived that day would prove something darker than a simple vulnerability. It would prove that preparedness has a limit when the scale of nature exceeds what even a highly advanced society has built itself to imagine. Because while the country was still absorbing the violence of the quake, the seafloor of the coast had already moved. A huge section of the ocean floor had shifted with such force that it displaced an immense volume of water. That water was now racing toward the coast. And in fishing towns, ports, seawall-lined harbors, schools, factories, fields, and neighborhoods spread along the specific shoreline of Tōhoku. The disaster was no longer underground. It was on its way in plain sight. At first, what came in was not always a towering wall. Sometimes it looked like black water advancing with impossible certainty. Sometimes it looked like a tide arriving far too fast. Sometimes it looked like a flood until the eye caught the details inside it. Cars spinning, houses rotating, fishing boats colliding, rooftops drifting, fire moving atop water, entire streets erased not by explosion but by motion. That was the most terrifying thing. The tsunami did not need to look dramatic from the beginning. It only needed to keep coming again and again. Video from that day shows the same impossible transformation. A road becomes a river, a parking lot becomes a basin, a neighborhood becomes a current. Buildings that seemed heavy enough to resist the world begin floating away in pieces. People on rooftops watch their towns dissolve into black water carrying timber, vehicles, fuel, and memory. Some had warning, some ran, some reached higher ground. Some did not believe the water would rise that far. Some believed the seawalls would hold. Some delayed for family, for photographs, for neighbors, for cars, for the one ordinary decision that becomes fatal when nature is already moving faster than thought. And then, as if earthquake and the tsunami were not enough, another layer of horror began. At Fukushima Daiichi, the tsunami locked out critical power and cooling systems. The disaster crossed a threshold from natural catastrophe into technological crisis. Now the story was no longer about drowning, impact, and destruction. It was about radiation, containment, invisible contamination, evacuation, and fear spreading through a country already in shock. This is why March 11, 2011 remains one of the defining catastrophe events of the 21st century. It was not one disaster, it was three: an earthquake strong enough to move the country, a tsunami large enough to erase coastal towns, and a nuclear emergency born inside a wreckage. The day began with shaking ground. It ended with a coastline broken open and a nation staring into the full cost of what happens when the sea rises higher than memory. The Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami struck on March 11, 2011, when a magnitude 9.0 undersea megathrust earthquake occurred off the northeastern coast of Honshu. The earthquake was one of the strongest ever recorded. It triggered a massive tsunami that devastated the Tōhoku region and sent destructive waves across the Pacific. Japan's northeastern coast was hit hardest, especially prefectures such as Miyagi, Iwate, and Fukushima. Towns were inundated, ports were destroyed, roads, rail lines, homes, schools, seawalls, farmland, fishing fleets, and industrial facilities were torn apart. The tsunami surged into river mouths, raced over coastal plains, and overwhelmed communities that had lived with the sea for generations. Nearly 20,000 people were killed or went missing. Hundreds of thousands were displaced. Entire neighborhoods vanished. And in one of the most consequential secondary disasters in modern history, the tsunami flooded the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, disabling power and cooling systems and triggering reactor core damage, hydrogen explosions, and a prolonged nuclear crisis that forced mass evacuations and reshaped national energy policy. It was not simply an earthquake story. It was not simply a tsunami story. It was the collapse of a coastal world under layered pressures, geologic, oceanic, technological, political, and emotional. What made this disaster especially haunting was that Japan was not unprepared in the ordinary sense. It had warning systems, it had earthquake-resistant construction, it had public education, it had disaster memory, and still, on that afternoon, the event was so large that entire assumptions about safety were broken in real time. That is why the 2011 tsunami remains such a powerful lesson, because it showed that the question is not only whether a society prepares, it is whether its preparation is large enough for the version of reality that eventually arrives. Before March 11, the Pacific coast of northeastern Japan was a landscape shaped by sea, work, and memory. Fishing ports set against the waterline, boats filled harbors, low coastal towns stretched beside bays, seawalls, river mouths, and roads that linked community to community along the shore. Inland, there were fields, rail lines, industrial zones, schools, homes, warehouses, convenience stores, and neighborhoods built around routines that had repeated for decades. The Tōhoku coast was not empty. It was not abstract. It was fully inhabited by lives that belonged to the sea even when they were not physically on it. That relationship with the sea was practical before it was romantic. Fishery, trade, shipping, local industry, transport, and daily identity all depended on coastal access. In some places, narrow valleys and steep terrain pushed settlements into low-lying areas near ports. In others, broader plains allowed towns to expand outward toward shore. Across the region, the coast meant livelihood, and like many coastlines deeply tied to livelihood, it also meant exposure. Japan had long lived with the knowledge that earthquakes and tsunamis were not rare in historical terms. This knowledge existed not only in science and government, but in cultural memory. Some communities remembered older tsunamis. Some had stone markers warning future generations not to build too low. Evacuation drills were part of school life. Seawalls, breakwaters, floodgates, designated evacuation routes, and hazard planning were not imaginary concepts. They were built into the geography. That is one of the reasons the 2011 tsunami felt so devastating on a civilizational level. It did not strike a society that ignored seismic danger. It struck one that had spent generations trying to live intelligently beside it. But intelligence is always built from past generation. And the future does not always repeat the past at the size we expect. The northeastern coast of Japan contained a complicated mixture of preparation and vulnerability. Some communities had substantial steel walls, some had evacuation hills or towers. Some schools drilled children to move quickly to higher ground, but many towns were still built close to sea level. Fishing facilities, homes, roads, and infrastructure necessarily set where the water could reach them. Ports cannot function on high hills. Coastal economies cannot operate far inland. This is one of the deepest tensions in all disaster geography. The places that make life possible are often the same places that make deaths efficient. There were also broader structural vulnerabilities, even in a highly organized society. Warning only works if people interpret it correctly and move in time. Evacuation only works if routes are clear, if elevation is sufficient, if vulnerable people can move, if assumptions about wave height are not too small, and if the physical defenses do not create a false sense of security. Technology can improve art, it cannot erase geography. And geography along the Tōhoku coast was complicated. Some areas were deeply indented by narrow bays and drier coastlines that could amplify tsunami effects. Other areas, such as the Sendai Plain, were flatter, allowing water to run far inland. Rivers and canals created additional pathways for the sea. Settlements near harbors and mouths of rivers were often exposed in ways that are only fully understood after the water comes through them. At that time, Japan's disaster systems produced a powerful confidence. That confidence were not irrational. It was earned through engineering, planning, and repeated survival. Buildings in Japan are among the most earthquake-conscious in the world. The country had extensive seismic monitoring, rapid alerts, public warning broadcasts, and well-developed emergency cultures. There was every reason to believe Japan could endure what many other countries could not. And in a sense, it did. The earthquake itself, despite enormous force, did not produce the kind of nationwide building collapse, death toll that might have occurred elsewhere with weaker standards. But the tsunami was another scale of problem, and at Fukushima Daiichi, another kind of vulnerability waited behind concrete and procedure. Nuclear facilities depend not only on strong structures, but on uninterrupted cooling systems, reliable backup power, and the assumption that protective systems will remain physically intact even under extreme external assault. Before March 11, that assumption still held. After the wave, it did not. So before the disaster, Japan's coast was not naive. It was prepared but still exposed. It was defended but still vulnerable. It remembered the sea, but not yet the exact version of the sea that was coming that day. And that may be the most unsettling aspect of what happened next. The coast was not caught sleeping. It was caught underestimating how high the ocean could rise when the Earth moved at its most extreme. The 2011 Japan tsunami began with a megathrust earthquake. A megathrust earthquake occurs at a subduction zone where one tectonic plate is forced beneath another. Of northeastern Japan, the Pacific plate is being subducted beneath the plate carrying northeastern Honshu. Over time, parts of that boundary lock. The plates continue trying to move, but friction holds them in place. Strain accumulates in the crust over years, decades longer. The rocks deformed. Energy builds slightly. Then the locked section fails. When it does, the release can be enormous. In the 2011 event, a huge part of the plate boundary ruptured beneath the ocean. The earthquake was magnitude 9.0, making it one of the strongest ever instrumentally recorded. That scale matters not only because of shaking intensity, but because a rupture of that size can shift the seafloor vertically over a huge area. And that vertical shift is what created the tsunami. A tsunami is not simply a large wind-driven wave, it is the result of sudden displacement of water, often caused by earthquakes, landslides, and volcanic activity. In this case, the seafloor moved abruptly, displacing the water column above it. That displaced water began propagating outward as long wavelengths, tsunami waves carrying extraordinary energy. In deep water, tsunami waves can move at tremendous speed, yet they are often visually deceptive offshore. The wave height may not seem dramatic in the open ocean because the wavelength is so long and the energy is spread through the entire water column. A ship may not understand what is passing beneath it, but once the wave approaches shallow coastlines, the situation changes. The wave slows because the seabed interferes with its motion. The energy compresses, the water rises. The wave can transform into a devastating surge that overtops sea defenses, floods low land, and carries enough force to destroy reinforced structures, ports, vehicles, and entire neighborhoods. The shape of the coastline matters enormously. Narrow bays can intensify water height and force. Flat plains allow inundation to extend far inland. River mouths and canals create pathways. Coastal defenses can reduce certain kinds of wave energy. But if the event exceeds design assumptions, those same defenses may be overtopped or bypassed, sometimes delaying fear just long enough to worsen outcomes. That is why some communities were devastated in different ways, even under the same tsunami system. The Tōhoku coast contained both drier coastlines and flatter open plains. In some places, water surged into narrow inlets and harbors with concentrated violence. In others, especially flatter areas like around Sendai, the tsunami spread inland over broad surfaces, continuing for great distances, carrying with it vehicles, timber, fuel, buildings, and debris. Another critical scientific point is that tsunami destruction is not just about height, it is about momentum. Fast-moving water is devastating because it exerts force continuously and because it carries debris. Once structures begin to break apart, the water becomes more destructive with every second. Cars turn into battering objects, houses become floating wreckage, boats become impact weapons. Fire can even move on the water if fuel and ignition sources combined, which happened in some places during the 2011 disaster. Then there is the earthquake itself. Japan's early warning systems functioned rapidly, and seismic engineering reduced building collapse in many areas. But earthquakes of this size can also alter land levels, strain infrastructure, damage roads, stop transportation, disrupt communications, and create immediate confusion. That confusion matters because tsunami evacuation is a race. If roads are blocked, if people are injured, if warning messages are underestimated, if elderly or hospitalized residents cannot move quickly, the hazard multiplies. At Fukushima Daiichi, the science of the disaster expanded again. Nuclear plants require continuous cooling even after reactors shut down, because decay heat continues. When the tsunami flooded the site and disabled backup generators and electrical systems, cooling capacity failed. Without sufficient cooling, reactor cores overheated, hydrogen accumulated and exploded in reactor buildings. The event thus became a cascading disaster. Tectonic rupture caused tsunami. Tsunami caused loss of power and cooling. Loss of cooling caused nuclear crisis. That is why March 11 is studied so intensely. It was not one hazard, it was a chain from plate tectonics to ocean dynamics to coastal inundation to technological breakdown. A chains kill differently than isolated events, because when one system fails, it removes the protection against the next. At 2:46 p.m., the earthquake struck. The shaking was violent, long, and unmistakably different from any ordinary seismic event. In cities, towns, factories, offices, homes, and schools, people were thrown into immediate response. Decks shook, lights swung, machinery stopped, trains halted. Emergency alerts flashed and sounded. Across the country, millions understood quickly that this was a major earthquake. In Tokyo, far from the coast of maximum destruction, high-rises swayed with a deep rolling motion that seemed almost impossible in solid structures. But farther north and closer to the source, the earthquake's force was even more serious. Coastal communities were already entering the first phase of catastrophe. Then the tsunami warnings came. Broadcasts urged people to evacuate to higher ground. Sirens sounded. Some communities reacted immediately. In schools, teachers moved children toward designated evacuation points. In homes and businesses, people grabbed family members and ran. In ports and harbors, workers tried to understand how much time remained. But time is not a simple thing in disasters like this. It exists differently for different people. For those already on high ground, minutes are enough. For the elderly, the injured, the isolated, the uncertain, or those waiting for family, minutes disappear instantly. The tsunami reached the coast. In some places, it rose over or around sea walls. In others, it pushed through harbors, river mouths, and low plains with devastating force. Video from the day shows black water advancing inland, not with the sudden vertical crash of a single wave, but with a relentless horizontal certainty that feels even more terrifying. It keeps coming. It occupies roads. It enters fields. It surrounds cars. It lifts houses. It turns cities, blocks into current. In Miyagi Prefecture, especially around the Sendai Plain, the tsunami traveled far inland across flat land. The visual aura there came from the scale of spread. Water moved across farms, airports, roads, and neighborhoods, carrying debris filled so vast that the land itself seemed to liquefy. Buildings burned while floating. Cars tumbled and collided. People on rooftops became tiny fixed points in a moving landscape that no longer obeyed ordinary rules. In Iwate and other rugged coastal areas, narrow bays and inlets intensified tsunami effects. Ports were destroyed. Towns were crushed against terrain that offered little horizontal escape. Fishing communities that had lived with the sea for generations found that the sea had risen higher than both memory and defense. In Fukushima Prefecture, the wave struck not only homes and towns but critical infrastructure. At Fukushima Daiichi, the tsunami flooded the site, overwhelmed protections, and disabled backup power systems. Reactors had shut down automatically, still required cooling. Without power, cooling systems failed. What began as a coastal natural disaster was now also becoming a nuclear emergency. Hydrogen explosions followed in reactor buildings over the coming days. Evacuation zones expanded. Public fear deepened. The disaster changed category in real time. And yet, along the coast, the original terror remained brutally physical. People were still trapped in buildings, still waiting on rooftops, still clinging to debris, still calling names into wind and water and sirens. The most terrifying moments were often not the initial impact, but the realization that the water was not stopping. It crossed roads people thought would remain clear. It reached buildings people thought were high enough. It overtook vehicles that had become trapped in traffic or indecision. It entered spaces that just minutes earlier had still felt structurally part of ordinary life. Then came the night, and night made everything worse. Cold darkness and aftershocks, fires, the ongoing nuclear crisis, families unable to communicate, towns with power evacuation centers failing, people staring at maps and broadcasts, trying to understand where their relatives had been when the sea came in. By the time the first day ended, the coastline of northeastern Japan no longer looked continuous. It looked broken into zones of ruin, silence, and uncertainty. In a coastal school district, teachers and children moved uphill after the earthquake. Training mattered, discipline mattered. The adults knew that hesitation kills in tsunami country. They counted children, shouted names, and kept moving even while roads trembled and sirens echoed. For some groups, that discipline became the difference between survival and annihilation. Later accounts from survivors could make one fact painfully clear. In tsunami evacuation, minutes are not measured by clocks. They are measured by whether people obey the first instinct to go higher without looking back. An elderly fisherman in one of the northeastern ports has spent his life reading the sea. He knew storms, currents, harbor winds, and ordinary tidal change. But this was different. He survived the earthquake, heard the warnings, and moved toward higher ground. When he turned back, he saw not a wave in the way people imagine it, but a black surge swallowing the harbor where he had worked for decades. Boats broke free and collided. Buildings near the shore began turning and breaking apart. He later described the worst part as recognition. The moment he understood that the sea he had trusted his entire life had become something that no knowledge of daily water could prepare him to face. At Fukushima, another kind of survival story was unfolding. Plant workers, emergency responders, and technical staff remained at or returned to the site under conditions that were rapidly becoming more dangerous and less predictable. Their enemy was not visible in the same way as the tsunami. It was heat, pressure, failing systems, hydrogen buildup, radiation risk, and the knowledge that every hour without restored control widened the scale of disaster. These workers did not face the cinematic aura of moving black water. They faced the cold technical aura of a system coming apart after the flood had already passed. Elsewhere, families spent the night in schools, gyms, community centers, or on upper floors of buildings that had survived. Some had escaped with nothing. Some had survived because they chose to run immediately rather than search for belongings. Some had lived because a teacher, a parent, a neighbor, or a loudspeaker made the right decision in time. And many who survived physically still entered another form of catastrophe in the hours that followed the waiting to know who was missing, waiting for phone lines to work, waiting for the names of the dead, waiting for rescue boats, waiting for food, heat, information, transport, and proof that the world had not ended completely. That is one of the defining truths of major disasters. The event itself is only one part. The human stories continue in the long corridor after impact, where survival becomes grief and grief becomes a new shape of everyday life. The aftermath of the 2011 tsunami was not one disaster response, it was many. First came search and rescue. Coastal towns had been inundated, roads were blocked, ports destroyed, rail systems damaged, and communications disrupted. Rescue teams had to work through mud, debris, cold conditions, unstable structures, and continuing aftershocks. Helicopters, boats, military units, firefighters, police, and local volunteers all became part of a vast effort to reach the standard and recover the dead. Then came displacement. Hundreds of thousands of people lost homes and could not return to them. Schools, gyms, public halls, and temporary housing became new centers of life. Communities that had existed for generations near ports and bays now faced the question of whether to rebuild in place, relocate uphill, or accept partial abandonment. That question was not merely technical, it was emotional, economic, and historical. To leave the coast could mean safety. It could also mean leaving behind the geography that had made the community possible in the first place. The fishing industry suffered enormous loss. Boats were destroyed. Ports were wrecked. Processing facilities, storage, roads, and harbor equipment were gone. Agriculture was also a hit, especially where salt water flooded fields and damaged land. Local economies were therefore broken at the root, not just inconvenienced. And then there was Fukushima. The nuclear crisis expanded the meaning of aftermath beyond conventional coastal disaster recovery. Large evacuation zones were established. Residents had to leave not simply because buildings were destroyed, but because contamination risk had transformed parts of the region into spaces of fear and uncertainty. Unlike flood damage, radiation anxiety is not easily visible. It follows people into food systems, public trust, government credibility, and national identity. That is why Fukushima changed the psychological map of the disaster. Some communities were grieving the dead. Others were displaced by contamination risk. Many were both. Public confidence in institutions also suffered. Questions emerged around seawall design assumptions, nuclear safety culture, emergency planning, backup systems, and the relationship between technological confidence and low probability extreme events. Japan, a country famous for discipline and engineering seriousness, was forced into a national confrontation with the possibility that even well-designed systems can fail if their assumptions are not large enough. The emotional aftermath was equally profound. Families lost not only homes but also grave sites, heirlooms, shops, schools, routines, and the continuity of local memory. Children grew up with evacuation routes burned into consciousness. Coastal communities rebuilt with higher seawalls, relocated housing, or changed land use. But rebuilding cannot restore the original emotional geography of a place once the sea has erased it. That is one of the deepest scars of tsunamis. They do not merely damage structures, they damage certainty. The 2011 Japan tsunami taught the world something both inspiring and frightening. Preparation matters, but skill matters too. Japan's warning systems, engineering culture, disaster education, and civic discipline saved many lives. There is no serious way to look at March 11 and conclude otherwise. A less prepared country might have suffered even more catastrophic losses from the earthquake alone. Evacuation drills, resilient structures, and alert systems all made a difference. Yet, the tsunami still exceeded expectation in places where expectation had already been high. That is the darker lesson. Nature does not care how advanced a society is. It only cares about force, geography, and whether assumptions are large enough for reality. After March 11, Japan re-examined sea defenses, evacuation planning, land use, and the design basis for critical infrastructure. Nuclear policy changed. Public trust had to be rebuilt. Coastal memory depended. Some communities moved upward. Others rebuilt differently. The country did not simply recover. It revised its understanding of what recovery and protection must mean in a world where low probability events still arrive. But the deepest lesson may not be technical at all. It may be moral. Disaster memory fades when ordinary life returns. People build again. They trust again. They move downward toward convenience, livelihood, and the hope that the worst version of the past will not repeat. It is human. It is also dangerous. Tsunami zones, old warnings, oral history, geological records, and engineering models all speak one language in different forms. The sea remembers farther than people do. On March 11, 2011, the ground shook first. That was the warning. Then the sea rose higher than roads, higher than harbors, higher than walls, higher than the confidence of a modern state that has spent generations trying to live intelligently beside danger. And after it had taken the coast, another invisible threat rose from the wreckage, reminding the world that the most devastating disasters are often not single blasts, but cascades. Earthquakes, tsunamis, nuclear crisis, one afternoon, one coastline, one nation forced to watch the limits of preparation in real time. That is why the event still matters so much, because it was not simply a natural disaster, it was revelation, a revelation that civilization can be disciplined, advanced, and technically brilliant, and still find itself overtaken when the Earth moves at its most extreme. The coast did not vanish because Japan was careless. It vanished because the sea came in larger than memory, and on that afternoon, the line between land and ocean, between safety and exposure, between preparedness and helplessness, was erased in black moving water.